Have you ever found yourself in one of those circular arguments where the person across from you seems to be playing a completely different game with a completely different set of rules? You lay out the facts, you offer a bridge of logic, and yet they seem perfectly content to stay on their side of the canyon, shouting at the clouds. We've all been there, and if we're being honest with ourselves, we've probably been that person once or twice too. Intelligence is a funny thing, because we often treat it like a fixed number, a score on a dusty paper from grade school, or a badge of honor we wear to feel superior. But in the world of psychology, intelligence isn't just about how fast you can solve a Rubik's Cube or how many capital cities you can name in 30 seconds. Real cognitive depth is about how we process the world, how we handle being wrong, and how much room we leave in our heads for things we don't yet understand. When we talk about habits associated with lower cognitive flexibility, or what some might call low IQ, we aren't talking about an inability to learn. We're talking about a set of behavioral ruts that keep the brain from ever having to stretch. Think of the human brain like a sophisticated GPS system. A high-functioning system is constantly recalculating, looking for traffic jams, and adjusting the route based on new data. But a brain stuck in these low-intellect habits is like a GPS that only knows one road and refuses to believe that a bridge has been built across the river. One of the most glaring habits you'll notice in this territory is an almost aggressive level of overconfidence in one's own knowledge. You might know this as the Dunning-Kruger effect, but in everyday life, it's the guy at the barbecue who explains quantum physics to a literal physicist after watching one 3-minute video on the internet. It's a strange paradox of the human mind. The less we know about a subject, the less we are aware of how much there is to know. This lack of metacognition, or thinking about our own thinking, creates a ceiling. When you believe you've already reached the finish line of understanding, you stop running, you stop asking questions, and that, more than any test score, is what stalls our intellectual engine. This leads us into a very cozy yet very dangerous habit, the refusal to embrace nuance. To a mind that isn't firing on all cylinders, the world is a collection of simple binary choices. It's black or it's white. It's good or it's evil. You're with me or you're against me. This is what psychologists call dichotomous thinking, and while it's a very efficient way for the brain to save energy, it's a terrible way to perceive reality. The real world is painted in infinite shades of gray, and navigating those shades requires a high degree of cognitive effort. It's much easier to just lean on a stereotype or a catchy slogan than it is to sit with the discomfort of a complex truth. When we see someone constantly reaching for the simplest possible explanation for a complicated problem, we're seeing a brain that is trying to protect itself from the exhaustion of deep thought. It's like a person who only eats plain crackers because they're afraid of the complexity of a 5-course meal. And speaking of protection, there is a deep-seated habit of externalizing blame that often plagues those who struggle with lower cognitive agility. Have you ever noticed that for some people, every failure is the fault of the weather, the government, their boss, or a shadowy conspiracy, but never, ever a result of their own choices? This isn't just about an ego problem. It's about a failure to understand cause and effect. Taking responsibility requires you to analyze your own behavior, project future outcomes, and admit a flaw in your current strategy. That's a lot of mental heavy lifting. It's much lighter on the brain to simply say, "The world is out to get me." By staying in the role of the victim, a person avoids the intellectual work of self-correction. They stay stuck in a loop, repeating the same mistakes while expecting different results, which, as the old saying goes, is the very definition of insanity. But in a psychological sense, it's also a sign of a stagnant intellect. We also have to talk about the need to be right versus the need to know. This habit is a major roadblock. For many, a conversation isn't an exchange of ideas, it's a battle for dominance. When someone with lower cognitive flexibility enters a discussion, they aren't listening to your points to understand them, they're just waiting for their turn to speak, or more accurately, their turn to win. This usually manifests as an inability to admit they're wrong, even when presented with undeniable evidence. To a high IQ mind, being proven wrong is an exciting moment because it means you've just gotten closer to the truth. It's an upgrade. But to a mind that is struggling, being wrong feels like a personal attack. It feels like a loss of status. So they double down. They get louder. They move the goalposts. They value the feeling of certainty over the reality of the situation. And in doing so, they miss out on the greatest superpower the human brain has, the ability to change itself. There's also a very physical, almost primal habit involved here, which is the inability to delay gratification. Now, we've all heard of the famous marshmallow test, where kids were told they could have one treat now or two treats later. The kids who waited generally had better life outcomes and higher cognitive scores. Why? Because the ability to see into the future, to simulate a version of yourself that doesn't exist yet, is a high-level brain function. People who struggle with this often live entirely in the now. This isn't the peaceful now of a Zen monk. It's a reactive now, driven by impulse. They buy things they can't afford. They say things they'll regret, and they choose short-term comfort over long-term growth. This impulsivity is a hallmark of a brain that isn't quite communicating effectively between the emotional centers and the rational prefrontal cortex. It's like a car where the accelerator is pinned to the floor, but the steering wheel is barely connected. If we look closely, we also see a habit of ignoring the context. Context is the why and the how that surrounds a fact. A person with lower cognitive flexibility often treats facts like isolated islands. They might see a news headline and react with pure outrage without looking at the date, the source, or the surrounding circumstances. They struggle to see the big picture because their mental zoom lens is stuck on the highest magnification. This makes them incredibly susceptible to misinformation and manipulation. If you can't connect the dots between how an event today might affect something 6 months from now, or how a person's history influences their current behavior, you are living in a very fragmented, confusing version of reality. It's like trying to understand a movie by looking at one single frame every 10 minutes. You'll see the images, but you'll never understand the story. Finally, there's the habit of talking more than listening. This sounds simple, but it's actually quite profound. Listening is an active, high-energy process. It requires you to hold someone else's thoughts in your mind, compare them to your own, and synthesize a response. Speaking, especially speaking about yourself or your own opinions, is relatively easy. It actually releases dopamine in the brain. People who are intellectually stagnant often get addicted to that dopamine hit of hearing their own voice. They dominate the airwaves, not because they have so much to say, but because they lack the mental bandwidth to take in what anyone else is offering. They're broadcasters, not receivers. But here's the beautiful thing about all of this. Habits are not destinies. While we often talk about IQ as if it's a height you're born with, the reality of our brains is much more fluid. We have this incredible thing called neuroplasticity. Every time you catch yourself being overconfident and decide to ask a question instead, you are building a new neural pathway. Every time you feel the urge to blame someone else and instead ask, "What was my part in this?" you are literally making yourself smarter. Intellectual growth isn't about how much information you can cram into your head. It's about the posture you take toward the world. It's about having the courage to be curious, the humility to be wrong, and the patience to look for the nuance in the gray areas. So, if you recognize some of these patterns in people around you, or even in your own reflection, don't see it as a fixed label. See it as a map. Now that you know where the ruts are, you can finally start to steer the car in a different direction. Intelligence isn't a trophy you win. It's a garden you tend to, one thought at a time. If this resonates with you, maybe take a moment today to lean into something that confuses you, or listen just a little longer than you speak. Your brain will thank you for the workout.